The rain came down red that morning. Not blood red, not rust red. Something between the two. The color of old pennies dissolved in battery acid, and it hissed where it hit the pavement outside Marin's window, like it was angry at the city for still being there. She watched it from the third floor of what had been a transit authority maintenance depot on the Lower East Side, now converted. Unofficially, illegally, and with considerable ingenuity, into a forward operations shelter for the last functioning cell of the New York resistance. 41 people had slept there last night. 40 were still breathing. Chen had gone out before dawn for water filters and hadn't come back. Nobody said anything about it. You didn't. Anymore. Marin pressed her palm flat against the reinforced glass and felt the vibration of the city through it. The Veth had been broadcasting again last night. That subsonic pulse they used for crowd suppression. The one that made your teeth ache and your vision swim and your thoughts go sideways. Half the shelter had woken up screaming. The other half had slept through it and felt worse for having done so, guilty in the animal way of survivors. She pulled her hand back. Flexion looked at her from the glass. 26 years old, a scar along her jaw from a compliance, sweep in January, dark circles that had become a permanent feature somewhere around the third month of the occupation. She still had both eyes. She counted that. Broadcast running again, said a voice behind her. Marin turned. Dov was standing in the doorway with 2 tin cups of something that approximated coffee if you didn't think too hard about what was actually in it. He was 40, maybe 45. She'd stopped asking people their ages after a while, because the answers always came out wrong, the years not matching the faces. He had the kind of stillness that came not from calm, but from having burned through panic so many times that the machinery was simply worn smooth. She took the cup. Same channel, new frequency. They're adapting. He moved to the window beside her, looked out at the red rain. Martinez thinks they've mapped our scanner hardware. Dark on those bands by tomorrow. So we adapt faster. Dov didn't say anything. He raised his cup. They drank. The Veth had arrived 14 months ago, in September, through a rift in low Earth orbit, that the astronomers had 6 hours to observe and document before the astronomers stopped existing as a professional class. The ships. If ships was even the right word, the Veth had a conceptual relationship with enclosed space that human language had trouble housing, had appeared first over the poles, then simultaneously over every major population center on every continent. No radio contact, no gestures toward diplomacy. The first act was the pulse, the second act was the fog. The fog was the worst thing they did, and they did many terrible things. It was atmospheric in origin, dispersed from the ships in wide sheets that settled over cities like a second sky. It didn't kill you. It didn't even make you sick, not technically. What it did was quieter and harder to fight. It suppressed the production of a specific protein in the human hippocampus. Not all memories, just recent ones. The fog made you forget the last 4 hours, then the last 8, then the last 16. People woke up in the morning not knowing how they'd gotten home, then not knowing where home was, then not knowing what home meant. The Veth called it compliance. Humanity, in the month since, had developed a number of other names for it. Marin was immune. She didn't know why. Maybe 3% of the population was, for reasons that immunologists, the ones who hadn't forgotten their own research, were still arguing about. She'd watched her mother forget her name over the course of a Tuesday. She'd watched her brother become a pleasant, cooperative, blank-eyed person who lined up obediently each morning at the distribution points the Veth had established, who accepted nutrition blocks and the compliance boosters with a smile, who no longer knew what he'd once been angry about. That was the thing about the fog. It didn't make people into slaves. It made them into something worse, volunteers. She finished her coffee. The girl from the subway, she said. Anyone talked to her yet? Dov's expression shifted in a way she'd learned to read. Yusuf talked to her. And she's immune. Her memory's intact. She remembers everything. Weeks in a Veth processing center, and she walked out. He paused. The way she describes it, Marin. She says she watched them run their scanners over her 6 times. She says they looked at the readings, and then they looked at each other, and they didn't know what to do with what they were seeing. Marin set down her cup very carefully on the windowsill. She's carrying something, Dov said. In her blood. In her cells. Something the fog couldn't touch. And something their hardware couldn't map. And the question is whether that something is replicable. Outside, a Veth patrol craft drifted past 3 blocks over, low and slow, its underside lit with that deep amber bioluminescence they used for ground scan. The red rain parted around it without wetting it. The craft didn't operate on the same physics as weather. Bring her up, Marin said. Her name was Sable. She was 22, wore her hair in a braid, so long it brushed her belt, and she moved through the shelter with a careful attention to her surroundings that Marin recognized as the gait of someone who had learned not to trust the apparent permanence of spaces. She sat down across the table from Marin and folded her hands and waited, which was more composure than most people managed. Tell me about the processing center, Marin said. Sable looked at her directly. Her eyes were an unusual color, somewhere between amber and gray, and they didn't flinch. They put you in a white room. No furniture. The walls are soft, not fabric, something biological. It moves when you press it. And then the fog comes through the ventilation, and the scanning starts. You remember all of it, every second. Something moved across her face that wasn't quite grief and wasn't quite pride. They scanned me with 2 different instruments. The second one, I don't know what it was looking for. But when the reading came back, the Veth who was holding it made a sound. Very quiet. I don't think it was meant for me to hear. What kind of sound? Sable paused. The kind people make when they're looking at something they recognize but were told didn't exist anymore. Marin let that sit. You have family, Marin said. It wasn't a question. Yusuf had done the intake. Had. Say's hands shifted on the table, one small unconscious movement. My sister. She was in the fog zone during the 3rd dispersal. She didn't finish the sentence. She didn't need to. Marin knew the particular silence that lived in that gap. She'd been living in it for 8 months. Okay, Marin said. I need a blood draw. I need full genetic sequencing with whatever equipment we have. And I need you to tell me everything you know about the layout of that processing center. Because if there's something in you that they couldn't map, I want to understand it before they come looking for you again. Sable looked at her for a long moment. Treek. Then she uncurled her left hand and laid it palm up on the table. I was hoping, she said, that someone was going to say something like that. The geneticist's name was Dr. Irina Vashenko. She'd been in the middle of a fellowship at Columbia when the Veth arrived, and she had adapted, as she put it, by applying the scientific method to survival. She ran Marin's genetic sequencing operation out of a converted bathroom on the 2nd floor, with equipment she'd built from scratch, out of components the scavenging teams brought in. And her success rate was such that nobody asked too many questions about the conditions under which she worked. She took Sable's blood at 8 in the morning and called Marin back at 3 in the afternoon with a voice that was doing its best to stay professional and not entirely succeeding. Sequence is anomalous, Vashenko said. She had a laminated printout spread across the bathroom counter and was pointing at sections of it with a pencil. Here and here. These markers, I've seen something like them before in pre-exposure immunity studies. Patients who were naturally resistant to the fog showed slight variations at these loci. Sable's variations are. She tapped the pencil against the paper several times. They're not variations. They're annotations. Marin looked at her. On occasions, someone modified this sequence. Deliberately, precisely years before the Veth arrived. Whoever did it wasn't working blind. They knew what was coming. Vashenko finally allowed herself to look up from the printout. They engineered her to survive this. The implications of that arranged themselves slowly in Marin's mind like blast debris settling after an explosion. Teens someone had known. Not guessed, not modeled, not theorized. Known, with enough specificity to encode a countermeasure into the genome of a young woman who would have been a child when the work was done. Protein interaction, Marin said. The one the compliance fog suppresses. Sabe's sequence produces a variant of it that the fog can't bind to. Molecular structure is just different enough that the Veth's bioagent slides off. Vashenko set down the pencil. And there's a secondary structure, here, that appears to actively generate a chemical signal that disrupts Veth scanner readings, like biological noise. Someone anticipated their exact surveillance frequency, and built in a jammer. Can we replicate it? The question landed in the room and stayed there while Vashenko looked at Marin with an expression that had several things in it at once. That's a question, Vashenko said finally, with a very long answer. Give me the short version. The short version is, not fast, not with what we have, not without understanding the original modification protocol. She paused. But the sequence is in the blood. The information exists. And information, she looked back down at the printout. Information is the one thing they haven't figured out how to make a fog for. Marin stood in that bathroom for a long time after Vashenko went back to her work, looking at a laminated printout of something that was, she was increasingly certain, the most important piece of paper in New York City. The Veth didn't have names. Or they had something analogous to names. Identifiers embedded in their bioluminescent patterns, readable to each other at distance, but they didn't translate. And humans had taken to assigning them designations based on behavioral role. The one that led the occupation of the Northeastern Corridor went by the designation Command 7 in Resistance Communications. It was large, even for a Veth. 7 feet of chitinous, multi-limbed biology that moved with a deliberate grace that didn't read as threatening until you understood that it had never been in a situation where threat was necessary. It had walked into situations that should have been hostile and found them already compliant. It had administered fog dispersals with the calm efficiency of someone completing routine maintenance. What Command 7 had never encountered in 14 months of occupation was a human who looked back. Marin had planned the intercept for 3 weeks. She had maps of the patrol routes. She had the chemical signature of Sable's blood, replicated incompletely, insufficiently, but enough to disrupt Veth scanners for approximately 40 seconds at close range. Based on Vashenko's modeling, she had 4 people she trusted completely, and 11 she trusted adequately. She had a building on West 34th Street, with a basement connection to the old transit tunnels, and a loading dock that faced away from the primary patrol corridor. And she had a plan that required ORD Command 7 to walk through a specific door at a specific time, which it would do, because the patrol route algorithms were adaptive, but not creative. And Marin had been watching them long enough to know the difference. What she also had, that she hadn't fully accounted for, was Sable. The girl had come to her the night before the intercept with that same folded hands composure and said, "I'm going with you." Marin had looked at her. Why? Because I'm the thing they want. If I'm there, Command 7 will stop when it sees me. It will want to understand what I am. And that pause. Sable had tilted her head slightly. That's your window. You're 22. You're 26. Marin hadn't had a good answer for that, so Sable went. The intercept happened at 4:17 in the morning, which was not the original planned time. The patrol algorithm had shifted, and Marin's team had spent 40 minutes crouched in a loading dock in the red-tinted dark, breathing shallowly, while the city's sleeping, fog-compliant population breathed in whatever the night dispersal had put into the air and dreamed the thin, structureless dreams of people whose recent memories had been neatly removed. Command 7 came through the door at 4:17 and saw Sable. It stopped. Marin had prepared for many responses: flight, aggression, the subsonic compliance pulse, and immediate distress broadcast to other units. She had not quite prepared for the specific quality of stillness that moved through Command 7's entire 7-foot frame when it saw the girl standing in the center of the room under a single work light. The Veth didn't have faces in the way humans did, but they had something that served the same purpose: a complex shifting arrangement of bioluminescent nodes that communicated internal state. And what moved across Command 7's nodes in that moment was something that Marin, watching from the dark at the edge of the room, could only describe as recognition. It knew what Sable was. No, that wasn't quite right. It knew what Sable represented. The fact of her existence meant something to Command 7 that Marin didn't yet have words for, but which she intended to find out. Seconds. That was the window Vashenko had modeled. In the event, they had 31. Command 7 recovered from its stillness faster than projected, its scanner already rising, its secondary limbs already shifting into the posture that Resistance intelligence had identified as pre-compliance deployment. Marin's team came out of the dark at second 8. There was no fight. Or there was. Briefly, but it was less a fight than a constraint problem. 6 humans with magnetic binding equipment developed from Veth materials, applying a solution that the Veth had never needed to develop a countermeasure for because nothing on Earth had ever successfully constrained a Veth before. Command 7 went down, not dead. Marin needed it, not dead. Dead things didn't answer questions. The silence in the building afterward was the loudest thing Marin had heard in months. Her own breathing seemed too large for it. Dov was beside her, breathing hard, and across the room, Sable was standing very still, looking at Command 7's bound form on the ground, with an expression that was not quite triumph and not quite grief, and was instead something more complicated. The expression of someone who has been running from a thing for a long time and has finally turned around to look at it directly. Marin walked to Command 7 and crouched down. The bioluminescent nodes had gone dark, which her intelligence said was a suppression response. Voluntary shutdown of communicative display. A Veth's equivalent of closing its face. She'd expected that. What she hadn't expected was for Command 7 to speak. Not in Veth, in something adjacent to English, broken and harmonic, and clearly constructed from analysis of recorded human speech rather than actual conversation, but comprehensible. 2 words directed at the ceiling, or possibly at nothing at all. You persist, it said. Marin looked at it. Correct, she said. Command 7's nodes flickered. Not dark, something else. The sequence. The girl. Its voice was the sound of something being slowly decoded. We reported it impossible. The modification predates our mapping of your species. Someone's force before we arrived. Yes, Marin said. Who? That, Marin said, is what I'm trying to find out. She was aware, crouched over a bound alien commander in a building in Midtown Manhattan, that this was either the most important conversation of her life or the last one. Possibly both. You came here expecting a species you could fog, Marin said. You ran your models. You assessed the biology. You built the compliance agent around what you found. And it worked. For 97%. She paused. But someone who knew you were coming built an exit into the other 3%. And you don't know who. And you don't know why. And you don't know what else they might have built. She looked at Command 7's dimmed nodes. That's what stopped you in this room. You looked at that girl, and you realized you might be in a war you thought you'd already won. Command 7 was quiet for a long time. Then, we have occupied 114 worlds. We have employed the compliance protocol on 47 species with biological cognition. 47 have been assimilated without exception. All 47 so far, Marin said. The nodes pulsed once, a deep amber wave that crossed Command's frame from crown to base. Marin had not seen that pattern before. She committed it to memory. What do you require? Command 7 said. Followed was not a negotiation in any sense that a diplomat would have recognized. There were no equal parties at the table. Was bound on the floor of a building in a city it occupied, and Marin was a 26-year-old woman with a scar on her jaw and a genetic sequencing printout folded in her jacket pocket. Marin had something that Command 7 needed more than Command 7 needed to escape. She had the sequence. Complete original modification protocol, which Vashenko had fully decoded the previous evening, which was not just a personal immunity, but a design document, a blueprint for a genetic modification that worked against Veth technology at the cellular level, that had been engineered by someone who had understood Veth biology before the Veth arrived, and which, if it spread, would make the compliance protocol worthless against an entire species. She didn't have the capacity to deliver that spread. Not yet. Vashenko was years away from a viable distribution vector. But Command 7 didn't know how far away she was. Here's what I require, Marin said. She sat down cross-legged on the floor. Not because she was comfortable, but because she'd found, over 14 months of this, that sitting down in an unexpected way was one of the few tools she had that reliably disrupted the pattern recognition of things that had been watching humans for a long time and thought they knew how humans moved. I require the withdrawal of compliance dispersal units from New York City, starting with the Lower East Side. Require a 72-hour window with no fog, no patrol pulse, no processing sweeps. During that window, I am going to contact every immune individual in this city, and I am going to explain to them what's in the sequence, and I am going to give them the choice to understand what's in their blood. Command 7's nodes flickered. You believe that exchange is of equivalent value. I believe, Marin said, that you don't know what you're looking at well enough to know whether it isn't. She reached into her jacket pocket and placed the laminated printout on the floor between them. That is a partial sequence, she said. You can have it, and you can give it to whoever does your molecular analysis. And they will tell you that it is partial, and then you will know that I have the rest. And then, she met the dim amber flicker of Command 7's nodes and didn't look away. And then, you have a choice about what kind of problem you want to be managing. The silence this time was different. It was the silence of something thinking. Whatever the Veth were, and humanity's understanding of their biology, psychology, and origin was still in its early stages, assembled piecemeal from observation and the fragments that immune individuals managed to carry out of processing centers. They were not simple. They were not malicious in the human sense, which was in some ways harder to work with than malice. They were operational. They had goals and they pursued them through calculated means. The fog was not cruelty. It was efficiency. Marin had spent 14 months learning to work with creatures who operated on efficiency. Sable moved. Marin heard her behind her, a soft step. And then the girl was crouching down on the other side of the printout, so that Marin and Command 7 and the partial sequence formed a kind of triangle on the floor. Sable looked at Command 7 without flinching, and Command 7 looked back at Sable, and another of those deep amber waves moved through the Veth's frame. Modified one, Command 7 said. It was not speaking to Marin. Sable didn't answer immediately. She reached into the pocket of her jacket and withdrew a small object, a child's tooth, milk white, which she'd been carrying since the day Marin met her, and which she held now in her open palm. Marin had never asked about it. Some things you didn't. My sister's, Sable said. She forgot she ever had it. She'd be embarrassed by that, if she could remember being the kind of person who'd be embarrassed. She looked up at Command 7. She was 8 when you came. She was going to be a doctor. She had specific plans. Command 7 was still. You have been to 100 worlds, Sable said, and every one of them was full of people with specific plans. Nothing moved for a long time. Then, Command 7's nodes did something that none of Marin's intelligence documentation had ever recorded. They cycled through 3 colors in sequence. Amber, then a deep violet, then a white that was almost too bright to look at, and then went dim again. Marin had no name for it. She filed it. 72 hours, Command 7 said. Marin picked up the printout and folded it back into her pocket. 72 hours, she confirmed. The dawn came gray through rain that had mostly stopped. Marin stood on the roof of the depot and watched the patrol craft drift northward. Still present, still operational, but the dispersal ports on their undersides closed. The amber ground scan lights dimmed. It wasn't peace. It wasn't even close to peace. It was a pause, which was different from peace in the way that holding your breath was different from breathing. Temporary, effortful, requiring the active choice of everyone involved to sustain it. It was 72 hours without fog. Dov came up behind her with more of the approximated coffee. She heard him stop a few feet back and stand quietly, which was what he did when he had something to say, and wasn't sure she was ready to hear it. I ran the numbers again, he said finally, on what Vashenko needs. Equipment time, personnel. If we could get the message out, really out, not just New York, and if even a quarter of the immune population responds, I know the numbers, Dov. You can't negotiate a species survival on a 72-hour window. I know that too. She took the cup, drank. The coffee was terrible and she was glad to have it. 72 is enough to make contact with every immune network we know about, which means it's enough to start the next 72 hours, and then the next. Dov was quiet. They're not stupid, Marin said. Command 7 will report to its superiors. There will be analysis. There will be calculation about whether the sequence I hold is a threat they can contain or a threat they have to negotiate around. She watched a patrol craft disappear behind a building. And while they're calculating, we're moving. Because that's what we do. We move faster than the calculation. You sound sure. I'm terrified, she said pleasantly. Those aren't the same thing. Below them, the city was beginning to wake. Fog-compliant population would go through its morning routine. The distribution points, the nutrition blocks, the gentle processing of people who no longer remembered what they'd lost. And none of that would change today. Basements and transit tunnels and converted maintenance depots. 31 people who still had their memories intact were going to receive a message from Marin's network, and that message was going to say, "We have something. Come in." Sable appeared at the rooftop door. She looked rested, which was surprising, and she was carrying the small white tooth in her closed fist, in the way she'd carried it since Marin first saw her. Not conspicuously, not like a talisman she was displaying, just present. A piece of information she was keeping. "They've pulled back from the East 14th Corridor," Sable said. "Dove's contact confirmed. The dispersal units are stationary." "Good." Marin looked at her. "How are you doing?" The question surprised Sable. That was clear from the slight shift in her expression, the tiny recalibration of someone who had been operating in a mode that didn't leave much room for questions like that. She looked out over the city. "I keep thinking about what Command 7 said, that it was impossible. The sequence." She turned the tooth in her fingers. "Someone made it possible before any of this happened. Someone sat down and designed a way for some of us to survive. And then they made sure it got into the world, without anyone knowing it was there." She paused. "I want to know who. I want to know how they knew. I want to know if they're still." She stopped. "Yeah," Marin said. "Me too." She'd been thinking about it since Vashenko first said the word annotations. Not random mutation. Not an artifact of medical treatment. A deliberate modification, precise and forward-looking, placed in a human genome like a key left under a mat, with the faith that someday someone would need it. Someone had looked at what was coming and had not panicked, had not despaired, had sat down and done the quiet, meticulous, unglamorous work of giving humanity a fighting chance. Had asked, not how do we stop this, but how do we survive this? And then, further, how do we make the surviving mean something? That was such a human thing to do. Precisely, stubbornly, characteristically human. To accept the impossibility of a problem and then solve the part of it that could be solved. Marin finished her coffee. "Okay," she said, "we have 72 hours. Let's not waste them." She went back down into the building, and Dov followed, and Seyful followed him, and the city spread out below and around them in the early gray light. Scarred, quieted, partially forgotten, still standing, and somewhere in the basements and tunnels and repurposed rooms of it, in the blood of the people who had inexplicably, infuriatingly, against every calculation the Veth had run, refused to comply, was a piece of information that no fog could dissolve, no scanner could map, no occupation protocol had anticipated. It was already moving. It had been moving since before the ships arrived. That was the thing about information. It didn't need permission. It just needed someone to carry it forward. 3 weeks later, Vashenko called Marin into the converted bathroom at 6 in the morning, with an expression that was not doing its professional best anymore, that had given up on professional and was just wearing what it actually was. A 52-year-old geneticist who had been working 18-hour days in a bathroom and had just solved something she hadn't been sure was solvable. On the counter were 4 small glass vials, in them a clear suspension. Slightly viscous, no color, looking like nothing more remarkable than very clean water. "It's not a full solution," Vashenko said immediately, which was her way of managing Marin's expectations, which she had learned was necessary. "It's a vector, inhalable. It carries a version of the sequence modification that will express in the respiratory epithelium first. Partial protection from the fog, enough to start recovering recent memory function within 72 hours of exposure. It won't work on everyone. Long-term compliance exposure may have." "Irina," Marin said. Vashenko stopped. "How many doses in 4 vials? As a proof of concept, maybe 200 exposures. As a seed culture, if we can get the right growth medium." She picked up a vial, turned it in the light. "Potentially scalable. Potentially." Marin looked at the 4 small glass vials on a bathroom counter in a city under occupation and thought about a person she'd never met, who had known something was coming, who had sat down with a problem that looked unsolvable and had found the part of it that could be moved. She thought about her brother who had forgotten her name. She thought about a little girl who was going to be a doctor and had specific plans. She thought about the word persist. Start the culture, she said. And then I need you to write down the complete protocol. Everything. Every step, every temperature, every compound. So that anyone, anywhere, with enough equipment and enough time, could reconstruct it from the document alone. Vashenko nodded once. She already had a notebook open. "And Irina," Marin said, "make copies as many as you can. We're going to make this information the most distributed thing in this city. Going to put it in so many hands, in so many places, that there's no fog thick enough and no scanner sensitive enough to find all of it." She picked up one of the vials, held it up to the gray morning light coming through the small high window. Such a small thing, such an unremarkable-looking thing to be carrying what it was carrying. "They can occupy a city," Marin said. "They can't occupy an idea." She set the vial down carefully and went to find Sable, because Sable needed to know, and because the girl had waited long enough for something that looked like a beginning. Outside, the rain came down clean,